Now let us see what exactly is an intent and how you can use an intent in an activity in Android. Now first of all, what exactly is an intent? Now by the word if you go, intent is something that means to do something. So it primarily is a means of how you could contact from an activity to another activity, how you could do something in Android. Now if you are aware with web application, if you see the code for a web page, how you move or how you navigate from a web page to another page, you've got a tag called ahref. You mention the page href and you can move using a link from a page to another page. Now how you navigate from an activity in Android to another activity. Now this is where you need an intent. Now intent is what you can use to move from an activity to another activity. You could use a call on a click of a button, or you could use some checkbox selection, or you can fire an event on any a UI component, and you can fire an intent that would take you from one activity to another activity. Now not simply just takes you from an activity to another activity, you can even take data within an intent from an activity to another activity and even come back carrying some result based on the data that you've already carried from activity 1 to activity 2. So it's a mean to communicate between two activities, and you could share data between the two with an intent. So intent is what connects between two activities, and it's not simply a means of navigating between two activities. It can do much more than what you need to navigate between two activities. Now what more can I do with an intent? Now you can initiate a call with an intent. You can initiate an SMS with an intent. You can send an email with an intent. You can add some attachment to the email when you send it through an intent. Now most of the time you can share socially through an intent. You can share on Facebook or Twitter using simple intents, and then you could pick any data from the mobile. If you need to select some contact or you need to select some media on the mobile, you can use an intent to pick up the data from the mobile. So it's a whole lot of things that you can do with an intent. Without writing classes for these, how you actually pick up things from these, you could use a simple intent to do many more things that simply make a call or an SMS or an email. So how exactly does an intent work? How do you actually create an intent, and how the intent works? Now for any activity you got a class name, and then the activity can also be identified by using an action name. So there are two ways you can identify a class for an activity, which is the name of the class and then the action name of the class. And then beyond that you could also use a category for an activity. Now based on what data you use for an activity to fire an intent, we got two types of intents. Now if you use a class name, then the intent is called as an explicit intent. Now this is called an explicit intent since you cannot have a same class name for different activities within the app. So if you use a class name for an intent, you know it is a one-to-one relationship. So it will be calling only one activity that is defined by this class name. So how do you declare such an intent? You simply say intent, declare a variable for it, say I. New intent, you pass in the context object for an activity can be this, and then the class name, I say my class.class. So this is how you create an intent based on a class name. So this is what we call as an explicit intent. Now let's see the other way around, the action name. So every activity can have a filter that specifies an action name and a category. So based on the action name, you can even fire up an intent that calls up the activity associated with that name. So since this is an action name, this is an implicit intent. Now why this is implicit? Since many activities can have that same action name. So this is not a limitation. It's not that an action name can be limited to a single activity. There are many activities that can share this action name. So when you call such an action, the relationship is 1:many. So you will be calling up many activities that could handle that action. For example, if you are looking for activities that could handle media or say images on a mobile, so you could see there are many activities that would pop up within a select option. That it depends upon what activity you actually want them to use. Or if you say share, then you got a number of options where you can share those pictures. You could put it on a Facebook, on a WhatsApp. So there are many actions through which not one but many activities will pop up. So in that case, you need a selector from which the user can select the actual activity that he wants. So in this case, we call this as an implicit intent. The relationship is one to many, and how you actually create such an intent is that instead of the class name, now you have an intent string which is the action name. So I'm just simply mention this as my intent is this. So this is not an intent or action name that is bound to some activity. So this can be kept by any other activity. So whenever you call this action name, any activity that has this action name can be called by this. So this is what we mean as implicit. Explicit, when you have a one-to-one, you actually mention the class name, and when you call an activity through action name, we call this as an implicit intent. So let's see how this works in code. I hope the concept of intent is clear. You can navigate between activities, and there's a whole lot activities that you can do using an intent. Now let us see a practical of what we are discussing. Now as you can see, we have an activity in the Android manifest file that is specified by name, and then every activity can have an intent filter. Now what I mean by can have is that this intent filter is not mandatory for every activity that you add to the Android manifest file. For example, I have an activity that called fourth activity does not have any intent filter. Now this sample activity, it being the launcher activity, it has a Android action name as main and a category called launcher. So this is something which we cannot control. This is something which we cannot change. So this has to be added to an activity which is the main launcher activity. But for any other activity, we can have any action name. Let me add something to this. Now as we had just declared so I could have an action name which is my intent is this, and I could specify a category to be, I can specify this to be a default activity. So now this activity can either be called by the class name which is fourth activity, or it could be called by an action name which is my intent dot is dot this. So every activity has an option to be called either by the class name or by an action name. Now this action name does not need to be unique across the application. So I can have another activity and I can copy the same action name to this. So you could have multiple activities that could have the same action name, but the class name is different. So this is what we mean by 1:1 mapping when you say explicit intent, and this is what we mean by 1:many when we say call by action name, and this is an implicit intent. So we'll just see how this works, how you could call activities with same action names, and how we call by a class name.